Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
There's a moment that almost nobody talks about. Not when she leaves. Not when she stops texting. Not when the relationship officially ends. The moment that breaks him happens earlier than that. It happens when her energy stops reaching him. And that sounds vague until you've lived it. Because sometimes she's still there. Her name is still in his phone. Her photos are still online. Nothing dramatic happened. But something changed. The warmth that used to find him doesn't anymore. The message still arrives, but it feels different. The attention is gone. The emotional reaching is gone. The invisible thing he never thought about stops arriving. And at first, he tells himself he doesn't care. Actually, that's not true. He tells himself he finally has space. Then he gets restless. Then irritated. Then strangely tired. Then one night he's staring at his phone at 1:17 a.m., reading an old conversation he hasn't opened in months. Trying to understand why silence suddenly feels heavier than conflict ever did. Because the truth is, some men don't break when a woman leaves. They break when they realize she stopped carrying part of their emotional world without them ever noticing. And by the time they understand what disappeared, it's already gone. The strange thing is, it usually doesn't begin with a breakup. No dramatic goodbye. No screaming match. No blocked number. No final speech. Most of the time, it starts with something so small that neither of them could explain it if someone asked. A shift. A subtle withdrawal. An absence where something used to be. And if you've ever watched this happen in real life, you know how difficult it is to describe. Because technically, she's still there. She still replies. She still answers when he reaches out. She hasn't disappeared. But something that used to travel toward him no longer does. The energy. The effort. The emotional reaching. And what fascinates me is how often he notices it immediately, while convincing himself he doesn't. I know that sounds contradictory. But people are contradictory. Especially when feelings are involved. Especially men. Especially men who have spent years learning how to feel something without admitting they're feeling it. I remember a guy telling me once that he knew something was wrong because she stopped sending him random photos during her day. Not romantic photos. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary things. A coffee cup. A dog she saw on a walk. A weird sign outside a grocery store. The kind of things most people barely think about. When it stopped, he didn't mention it. Didn't ask about it. Didn't even consciously acknowledge it. But 3 weeks later, he found himself scrolling through old messages at midnight. Looking for those photos. Not because of the photos. Because of what they represented. Someone thinking about him when she didn't have to. Someone reaching. Someone including him in the small corners of her day. And now that reaching was gone. The strange part? He kept telling himself he preferred it this way. Less pressure. More freedom. More space. That word. Space. It's amazing how often people use it when they don't fully understand what they're feeling. He said he needed space. Maybe he did. Partially. But that's not the whole story. Sometimes space is what we call emotional uncertainty when we're trying to make it sound mature. Sometimes it's what we call fear. Sometimes it's what we call overwhelm. Sometimes it's what we call wanting someone close, while also wanting an escape route. And that's where things get messy. Because when her energy begins pulling back, his first reaction often isn't sadness. It's relief. Temporary relief. The relief of not having to answer difficult feelings. The relief of not feeling emotionally responsible. The relief of not having to decide what he wants. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, everything feels lighter. His phone is quieter. His mind feels less crowded. He tells himself things are fine. Better, even. Then something strange starts happening. His body notices before his mind does. He starts checking his phone more often. Not consciously. Just little glances. Tiny habits. Moments that happen so quickly he barely registers them. Waiting in line for coffee. Checking. At a red light. Checking. Sitting on the couch while a show plays in the background. Checking. No message. No notification. Nothing. And every time he looks, he tells himself he wasn't looking for her. Just checking. Just habit. Just boredom. Sure. Maybe. But then why does disappointment show up every time her name isn't there? That's the question nobody wants to answer honestly. I think that's what makes this stage so fascinating. Nothing has happened yet. At least not externally. The relationship hasn't necessarily ended. The connection hasn't necessarily disappeared. But his nervous system is already reacting to a change his conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. And if you've ever experienced this, you know how irrational it can feel. You can go through an entire day functioning normally. Answer emails. Go to meetings. Laugh with friends. Get groceries. Fold laundry. Watch videos. Do all the ordinary things. And then suddenly, while putting dishes away, you realize you haven't heard from someone. Not because they owe you a message. Not because there's a problem. But because something that used to exist no longer arrives. And the silence feels different. Not louder. Different. More intentional somehow. More permanent. Even when you have no proof that's true. I remember one man describing it like this. He said it felt like walking into a room where a clock had stopped ticking. For a while you don't know what's bothering you. You just know something feels off. Then eventually you realize. The sound is gone. That's what her energy pulling back often feels like. Not an explosion. The disappearance of a rhythm. A presence. A familiar emotional background noise. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because many men don't realize how much they depended on that presence. Not consciously. Not maliciously. Not in a selfish way. Just quietly. Humanly. They got used to it. The morning text. The check-in. The curiosity. The emotional availability. The feeling that someone was paying attention. The feeling that someone was emotionally facing them. Then one day, she isn't. Not in the same way. And he notices. Immediately. But admitting that would require vulnerability. So instead he does what a lot of people do. He intellectualizes. Minimizes. Distracts. Explains it away. She's busy. Maybe she's tired. It's not a big deal. I'm overthinking. And sometimes all of those explanations are true. But the body is funny. The body often knows before the story catches up. Which is why he'll say he's fine. While opening her profile. He'll say he's moved on. While rereading old conversations. He'll say he doesn't care. While noticing the exact time she was last online. Not because he's obsessive. Because he's confused. There's a difference. Confusion creates some of the strangest behavior you'll ever see. Especially in people who aren't comfortable with their own emotional needs. Part of him wants reassurance. Another part feels embarrassed for wanting reassurance. Part of him misses her. Another part is irritated that he misses her. Part of him wants to reach out. Another part refuses. So he does nothing, which becomes its own kind of suffering. And if I'm being honest, this is usually the stage nobody talks about publicly. Because it doesn't look dramatic enough. Movies don't show this part. The quiet check-in. The deleted messages. The pretending. The private confusion. The moments where someone sits in their car after getting home and doesn't immediately go inside. Just sitting there. Engine off. Phone in hand. Thinking about someone they claim not to think about anymore. I've done things like that. Maybe you have too. Maybe that's why this feels familiar. Because human beings are far less logical than we pretend. We notice changes in emotional connection long before we're ready to discuss them. Sometimes long before we're ready to admit them to ourselves. So when people ask when he starts breaking, it usually isn't later. It usually starts here. At the beginning. The moment her energy changes. The moment she stops reaching. The moment he feels the difference but refuses to name it. The moment relief and anxiety arrive together. The moment he tells everyone he's fine. And maybe even believes it. For a while. Until one day he catches himself looking at his phone again. Waiting for something. Someone. A feeling. A familiar emotional presence. And that's when the first crack appears. Not because she's gone. Because for the first time, he realizes she might actually stop coming toward him. The strange thing about silence is that not all silence feels the same. That's probably why he doesn't recognize what's happening at first. Because they've had quiet periods before. Everybody does. People get busy. Life gets messy. Someone gets overwhelmed. Messages slow down. A few days pass. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth worrying about. He's seen silence before. He's survived silence before. So when it starts happening again, he tells himself it's the same thing. It has to be. Except, this one feels different. And he can't explain why. Not immediately. Maybe not even for weeks. Because on paper, nothing looks dramatic. Nobody left. Nobody slammed a door. Nobody made a scene. She still responds. She still exists in his world. But somehow the silence feels heavier. Not louder. Not colder. Just heavier. Like something underneath it has changed. And if somebody asked him directly, he probably wouldn't know how to answer. What's wrong? Nothing. Then why do you seem distracted? I'm not distracted. Then why did you just check your phone 3 times in 5 minutes? No answer. Because that's where this gets uncomfortable. A lot of emotional realization doesn't happen in thoughts. It happens in behavior. The body starts revealing things the mind hasn't admitted yet. That's why he keeps checking. Not because he's waiting for a message. At least that's what he tells himself. He's checking sports scores. Checking work emails. Checking notifications. Checking the weather. Checking anything except the thing he's actually checking. And every once in a while her name flashes through his mind. Only for a second. Then he's on to something else. Or at least he pretends to be. I remember someone describing it this way. He said he kept opening his phone and forgetting why. Over and over. Like his body had a destination his mind wasn't willing to acknowledge. And honestly, that feels painfully accurate. Because there comes a point where he starts realizing he's waiting for something. Not a specific text. Not a specific conversation. A feeling. The familiar feeling of being reached for. And that's what makes this silence different. Previous silences still contained connection. This one doesn't. Or at least it feels that way. Before, she would disappear for a few hours and then come back with energy. Come back with curiosity. Come back with presence. Now the interactions feel thinner somehow. More functional. More polite. Like the emotional current underneath everything has weakened. Again, nothing dramatic. That's what makes it so hard to explain. Imagine someone turning down music 1% at a time. You don't notice immediately. But eventually you're standing in a room wondering why everything feels different. Why everything feels slightly empty. And that's where he finds himself. In a space that looks exactly the same from the outside. But doesn't feel the same anymore. The hardest part? He still can't tell whether he's imagining it. That uncertainty creates its own kind of torture. Because certainty hurts. But uncertainty lingers. Uncertainty keeps conversations alive inside your head. Maybe she's pulling away. Maybe she's not. Maybe she's just tired. Maybe she's busy. Maybe you're overthinking. Maybe you're finally seeing something that was already happening. The mind becomes a courtroom. Every piece of evidence gets argued from both sides. And no verdict ever arrives. So he keeps functioning. Work. Gym. Friends. Errands. Life continues. But now there are strange moments. Ding moments. Moments nobody sees. Like standing in the kitchen waiting for coffee to brew. And suddenly thinking about her. Not even a memory. Just her. Then immediately feeling annoyed. Why am I thinking about this? You aren't. Then why did she just cross your mind? Because silence leaves room. And room allows things to surface. Things distraction used to keep buried. Things noise used to cover. Things movement used to outrun. I think that's why some people stay busy after emotional disconnection. Not consciously. They're not running from someone else. They're running from what appears when everything gets quiet. Because quiet reveals things. Especially the things we've been avoiding. And if we're being honest, a lot of men are experts at avoidance. Not because they're weak. Not because they're heartless. Sometimes because nobody ever taught them what to do with certain emotions once they arrived. So they delay. Distract. Postpone. Compartmentalize. Until eventually the feeling starts leaking through anyway. Usually in ridiculous ways. One guy told me he reorganized his entire apartment one weekend. Closets. Kitchen drawers. Storage bins. Everything. 12 straight hours of cleaning. And halfway through folding towels, he suddenly realized he wasn't cleaning. He was overwhelmed. He just didn't know it. I laughed when he told me. Then I stopped laughing. Because I've done similar things. Maybe you have too. When the heart doesn't know what to do, sometimes it starts organizing shelves. Sometimes it starts working overtime. Sometimes it starts scrolling endlessly. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to hear what silence is trying to say. And what silence is saying now is something he doesn't want to hear. She isn't reaching anymore. Not the way she used to. That realization doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives sideways. Unexpectedly. Like hearing someone mention her name. Like seeing a place she once loved. Like finding an old voice note while deleting files. Suddenly the truth appears. Not fully. Just enough. Enough to make him uncomfortable. Enough to make him restless. Enough to make him start asking questions he doesn't want answers to. Then comes the really awkward part. The bargaining. Not with her. With himself. He starts creating explanations. Maybe I just need to focus on myself. Maybe this is healthier. Maybe I became too dependent. Maybe distance is good. And some of those things might even be true. The problem is that truth and avoidance often wear similar clothes. That's what makes self-awareness difficult. You can convince yourself you're choosing space when you're actually afraid. You can convince yourself you're detached when you're actually hurt. You can convince yourself you've moved on while secretly checking whether someone viewed your story. Human beings are incredibly creative when it comes to protecting themselves. Especially from emotional vulnerability. Especially from rejection. Especially from grief. Because grief doesn't always arrive after someone leaves. Sometimes grief arrives when you realize they're already halfway gone. And that's what this silence carries. Not loss. The possibility of loss. Which is somehow worse. Because now every interaction feels loaded. Every message gets analyzed. Every delay feels meaningful. Every conversation feels slightly fragile. And the worst part is he often knows he's doing it. He knows he's overthinking. He knows he's reading into things. He knows he's becoming emotionally reactive. And yet, he can't stop. Because awareness doesn't automatically create control. That's another awkward truth nobody likes discussing. Sometimes you know exactly what's happening and still can't change your reaction. Sometimes you recognize the pattern while actively participating in it. Sometimes you watch yourself become emotionally attached in real time and still feel powerless to stop. Late at night tends to be the hardest. Not because anything special happens. Because distractions run out. The day stops defending him. The noise disappears. The notifications slow. The conversations end. And suddenly he's alone with himself. Alone with a silence that feels different than it used to. Alone with a feeling he can't fully name. Then maybe he reaches for his phone. Maybe he opens an old conversation. Maybe he scrolls for a minute. Maybe longer. Maybe he stares at a message she sent months ago. A completely ordinary message. Something that wouldn't have mattered back then. And now somehow it matters. Not because of the words. Because of the energy inside them. The warmth. The effort. The familiarity. The reaching. And that's when something inside him starts understanding what his mind has been avoiding. This silence isn't painful because nobody is talking. This silence is painful because he can feel the absence of someone who used to emotionally move toward him. And for the first time, he isn't entirely sure she's coming back. That's the moment everything changes. Not externally. Internally. Quietly. Almost invisibly. The silence hasn't gotten louder. He's simply stopped being able to ignore it. I don't think what breaks him is what he loses. At least not at first. I think what breaks him is finally seeing what was there all along. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't recognize emotional effort while it's happening. They recognize it after it's gone. Not because they're bad people. Not because they're selfish. Because human beings adapt to what becomes consistent. We stop noticing things that become part of the wallpaper of our lives. The same way you stop hearing the refrigerator humming. The same way you stop noticing the scent of your own home. The same way you forget how much sunlight enters a room until several cloudy days arrive in a row. And she had become part of the emotional background of his life. Not the center of it. Not always. Just present. Steady. Available. Reaching. And he got used to it. That's the dangerous part. Not taking someone for granted in some cruel, intentional way. Just becoming accustomed to their presence. Accustomed to their care. Accustomed to the fact that somebody was quietly paying attention. I remember hearing a man describe this realization years after it happened. He didn't talk about missing her beauty. He didn't talk about sex. He didn't talk about romance. He said, she remembered everything. Then he got quiet. And somehow that sentence carried more grief than anything else he said. Because that's what he missed. Not the big moments. The invisible ones. The things nobody applauds. The things nobody posts online. The things that don't look important until they disappear. Like her remembering he had an important meeting on Tuesday. Then texting afterward. How'd it go? Such a small question. 8 words. Maybe less. But do you know what sits underneath a question like that? Attention. Presence. Mental space. It means somebody carried a piece of your life around in their mind while they were living their own. And that's not a small thing. It only looks small. There are people who spend years in relationships without ever feeling genuinely remembered. Without ever feeling genuinely noticed. And sometimes he doesn't realize how much those little moments mattered until nobody asks anymore. Nobody remembers. Nobody follows up. Nobody checks. Then suddenly the absence becomes visible. And that's when the inventory begins. Not intentionally. His mind starts collecting memories without permission. Random memories. Ordinary memories. The dangerous kind. The kind that don't seem important enough to hurt. Until they do. Like her asking if he made it home safely. Like her noticing when his energy felt off. Like her saying, "You seem tired today." And him responding, "No, I'm good." Even though he wasn't. Even though he looked exhausted. Even though she somehow noticed anyway. Maybe that's part of what he misses. Being seen. Not perfectly. Not completely. Just enough. Enough to feel recognized. Enough to feel understood in moments when he didn't even understand himself. And here's where things become emotionally complicated. Because sometimes while she was doing all these things, He barely reacted. Not because he didn't appreciate them. Because he expected them. That's the embarrassing truth. Expected them. Not consciously. Not maliciously. Just assumed they would always be there. Assumed she'd remember. Assumed she'd ask. Assumed she'd reach out. Assumed she'd care. And assumptions are dangerous. Because assumptions hide value. They make extraordinary things look ordinary. Until they're gone. Then suddenly every memory gets reclassified. What used to seem normal now feels precious. What used to seem routine now feels irreplaceable. And the mind starts doing something strange. It starts revisiting moments that didn't seem important at the time. I think that's one of the cruelest parts of loss. The things that haunt you aren't usually the dramatic scenes. They're the random Tuesday afternoons. The grocery store conversations. The moments in the car. The voice notes. The jokes. The completely forgettable interactions that become unforgettable later. Maybe he remembers her sending a picture of something ridiculous she saw while shopping. Maybe he rolled his eyes. Maybe he responded with one word. Maybe he was distracted. Busy. Tired. Whatever. At the time it seemed insignificant. Now months later he would give anything to receive that picture again. Not because of the picture. Because of what it meant. Someone thought of him. Someone reached. Someone wanted to share a meaningless moment simply because it was him. That's intimacy. Not the grand gestures. Not the movie scenes. The sharing of meaningless things. The assumption that someone belongs inside your everyday life. And when that disappears, you realize how much emotional weight it was carrying. Weight you never saw. Weight she carried quietly. Weight he benefited from without fully understanding. Sometimes I think men struggle with this realization because emotional support often arrives in forms that don't look like support. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes support looks like curiosity. Sometimes support looks like consistency. Sometimes support looks like someone remembering details. Sometimes support looks like somebody asking a second question when everyone else stopped at the first. How are you? Good. Most people leave it there. Someone who cares says, "Are you sure?" And suddenly you're having a completely different conversation. She carried things like that. Invisible things. Things that don't show up in relationship statistics. Things that can't be measured. Things you don't realize are protecting you until they're gone. And maybe that's why the silence feels heavier now. Because it's not just silence. It's the absence of hundreds of tiny emotional touches. Tiny reminders. Tiny moments of attention. Tiny acts of care. All gone. Or at least reduced enough that he can finally feel their absence. I think one of the most painful realizations happens when he understands she was paying attention to him in ways he wasn't paying attention to her. Not because he didn't care. Because he was comfortable. Comfortable people often stop noticing effort. Then one day he remembers something. Something painfully small. Maybe she always knew when he was stressed. Before he said anything. Maybe she'd hear it in his voice. Maybe she'd see it in how long it took him to respond. Maybe she'd notice it in the way he sighed before speaking. Tiny details. Ridiculous details. The kind of things nobody should notice. But she did. And now nobody does. That's when grief becomes specific. And specific grief hurts more than general grief. General grief says, "I miss her." Specific grief says, "Nobody notices when I pause before answering questions anymore. Nobody remembers I hate making phone calls. Nobody asks how that thing went. Nobody notices when I'm pretending to be okay." Specific grief has texture. Weight. Detail. And detail is what makes loss feel real. There's an internal conversation that often happens around this point. A conversation nobody hears. It sounds something like this. "I miss her. Do you?" "Maybe." "What do you miss?" "The connection." "Which part?" The silence gets uncomfortable here. Because suddenly the answer isn't romance. It isn't passion. It isn't chemistry. It's care. Attention. Presence. The invisible emotional labor he never had words for. And maybe that's what creates the deepest regret. Not realizing someone was carrying something valuable until they put it down. Not understanding effort until effort stops. Not recognizing love while it still had somewhere to go. And the hardest truth, sometimes she got tired. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just tired. Tired of carrying emotional weight that nobody acknowledged. Tired of reaching. Tired of remembering. Tired of initiating. Tired of paying attention while feeling unseen herself. And maybe he never intended for that to happen. Maybe if someone had explained it clearly enough, he would have understood. Maybe. Or maybe he would have nodded and gone right back to sleep emotionally. Who knows? Human beings are strange. Sometimes we need absence to reveal presence. Sometimes we need silence to reveal effort. Sometimes we need loss to reveal value. Not because we're cruel. Because we're human. And now, sitting alone with this quieter version of reality, he starts noticing things he should have noticed earlier. The follow-up questions. The random check-ins. The remembered details. The concern. The consistency. The reaching. All those invisible threads she carried for both of them. And for the first time, he understands something that arrives far too late. The reason her absence feels so heavy isn't because she was loud. It's because she was quietly holding together pieces of his emotional world he never realized were being held at all. One of the most confusing things about emotional loss is that it rarely arrives on schedule. Movies get this wrong all the time. Something happens. A person leaves. The music swells. The tears come. The audience understands exactly what the character is feeling. Real life is usually nothing like that. Real life is delayed. Messy. Inconvenient. Sometimes embarrassingly late. Especially for men. And I don't mean that as criticism. I mean it as observation. I've seen it too many times. The thing that hurts him isn't always what happens. It's what happens 3 weeks later. 6 weeks later. 3 months later. When nobody else is paying attention anymore. When everyone assumes he's moved on. When even he assumes he's moved on. That's often when the impact finally arrives. Because in the beginning, survival takes over. Life continues. Work still expects him to show up. Bills still need to be paid. The gym still opens at the same time. Friends still send memes. The world doesn't pause just because something emotional shifted. So he keeps moving. And movement creates the illusion of healing. But movement and healing are not always the same thing. Sometimes movement is just movement. And he gets really good at it. He wakes up. Gets dressed. Answers emails. Makes plans. Shows up. Functions. If someone asked him how he's doing, he'd probably say, "Fine." And maybe he even believes it. At least partially. Because there's no obvious pain. Not yet. The silence has become familiar. The missing attention has become normalized. The absence has settled into the background. Or so he thinks. Then one random Tuesday something happens. Not a major event. Not a life-changing moment. Something stupid. Something tiny. And suddenly the emotional bill arrives. I remember hearing a guy talk about driving home from work one evening. Nothing unusual about the day. No memories. No triggers. No dramatic realization. Just traffic. Streetlights. A familiar route. Then a song came on. Not their song. Not even a romantic song. Just a song she happened to like. And he had to pull over. Not because he started crying. Because his chest suddenly felt tight. Because for the first time in months, he wasn't distracted. For 3 minutes, there was nowhere for his attention to run. And the feeling caught up. That's the part people don't understand. Emotions are patient. They wait. You can outrun them temporarily. You can postpone them. You can bury them under work and routine and noise. But eventually they catch up. And when they do, they often arrive disguised as something else. Restlessness, irritability, fatigue, boredom, numbness. A strange feeling that something isn't right. A lot of men think they're stressed when they're actually grieving. Think they're tired when they're actually heartbroken. Think they're burned out when they're emotionally overwhelmed. Because nobody taught them how emotional pain can wear different clothes. Nobody taught them that grief doesn't always cry. Sometimes grief cleans the garage. Sometimes grief works late. Sometimes grief spends 4 hours scrolling social media without absorbing a single thing. Sometimes grief says, "I've fine," 20 times a day, and means it less every time. The delayed impact usually begins in places where distraction can't fully protect him. Driving is one of them. Showers are another. Late nights. Long walks. Empty apartments. Those spaces where the mind finally catches up to the body. That's when strange memories start appearing. Not because he's trying to think about her. That's what makes it unsettling. The memories arrive uninvited. A sentence she said 6 months ago. A laugh. The way she'd pronounce a certain word. Something she used to complain about. A random story she told over dinner. Memories he hadn't thought about in years. And suddenly they're back. Not all at once. Just enough. Like emotional breadcrumbs leading somewhere he doesn't want to go. I think that's why delayed grief feels so confusing. It doesn't arrive with a label. Nobody hands you a note saying, "Congratulations, you're now processing emotions you avoided 6 weeks ago." Instead, you just start feeling strange. Detached. Distracted. Emotionally crowded. Like something is taking up space in your mind. And because the feeling isn't obvious, he starts looking for explanations. Maybe work is exhausting. Maybe I need a vacation. Maybe I'm just getting older. Maybe I need better sleep. Maybe. Sometimes all of those things are true. But sometimes they're incomplete answers. Sometimes the real answer is sitting quietly underneath everything. Waiting. And the longer it's ignored, the louder it becomes. I remember another man telling me about cleaning his apartment at 2 in the morning. Not because it was dirty. Because he couldn't sleep. Every drawer. Every shelf. Every cabinet. He organized everything. Then he found an old receipt. A completely meaningless receipt. From a restaurant they'd gone to together. And suddenly he was sitting on the kitchen floor staring at a piece of paper. Not crying. Just staring. Trying to understand why something so small felt so heavy. The receipt wasn't important. The memory wasn't even that special. But emotions don't operate according to logic. They operate according to meaning. And meaning often hides inside ordinary things. That's why delayed impact feels sneaky. The emotional weight isn't attached to major milestones. It's attached to little details. A coffee shop. A parking lot. A movie quote. A scent. A restaurant menu. A certain time of day. Tiny things become emotional landmines. And he never knows when he'll step on one. One afternoon he feels completely fine. The next afternoon he's standing in a grocery store staring at her favorite snack. Suddenly unable to focus. Not because of the snack. Because memory attached itself to something ordinary. And ordinary things are everywhere. That's the problem. You can't avoid ordinary things. You can avoid a person. You can avoid a location. You can avoid a conversation. You can't avoid Tuesday. You can't avoid driving home. You can't avoid hearing someone laugh. You can't avoid seeing a couple argue in a parking lot and remembering a conversation from 2 years ago. Life keeps accidentally reminding you. And eventually he notices something uncomfortable. The feeling isn't going away. Not completely. Not on its own. Not because enough time passed. That's another myth. People talk about time as if time heals. Sometimes it does. Sometimes time just gives you more room to avoid. And avoidance can look surprisingly productive. You can spend months functioning beautifully. Working, traveling, dating, exercising, smiling. Meanwhile, an emotional realization is sitting in the waiting room of your mind, patiently waiting for its turn. And eventually its turn comes. Usually when life gets quiet. Usually when nobody is watching. Usually when he has exhausted every distraction available. Then the delayed impact finally says, "We're doing this now." And suddenly things start making sense. The random restlessness. The checking. The nostalgia. The emotional sensitivity. The strange loneliness that didn't match reality. All of it was connected. All of it was part of the same unfinished experience. And here's the really painful truth. Sometimes the delayed impact isn't about losing her. It's about finally understanding her value. Those are not always the same thing. Losing someone hurts. Realizing what they meant after they're gone hurts differently. Because now regret enters the room. Not overwhelming regret. Subtle regret. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. Maybe I should have listened more. Maybe I should have paid attention. Maybe I should have asked different questions. Maybe I thought there would be more time. Those thoughts rarely arrive during the relationship. They usually arrive afterward. When the emotional dust settles. When the noise fades. When the excuses stop working. And that's when the delayed impact becomes impossible to ignore. Not because she's suddenly absent. Because he's finally present. Present enough to feel what he spent months avoiding. Present enough to recognize what disappeared. Present enough to understand that the silence wasn't the wound. The silence simply gave the wound room to speak. And now, sitting alone in a car. Or lying awake at 2:13 in the morning. Or staring out a window while pretending to watch television. He begins to realize something. The hardest emotions weren't waiting for the day she stopped reaching. They were waiting for the day he finally stopped running. And unfortunately for him, that day has arrived. This is usually the chapter nobody admits. Not publicly. Not honestly. Because this is where emotions stop looking noble. This is where the clean narratives fall apart. This is where people stop sounding evolved and start sounding human. Messy. Confused. A little embarrassing. A little irrational. A little obsessed. Because once her energy stops reaching him, and once the delayed impact finally catches up, something strange begins to happen. He starts doing things he would never admit out loud. Not because they're terrible. Because they're revealing. And revealing things are uncomfortable. Especially for someone who built part of his identity around appearing unaffected. The first behavior is usually harmless. Almost invisible. He checks her profile. That's it. Nothing dramatic. No message. No interaction. No reaching out. Just checking. A quick glance. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Then he closes it. Done. Back to life. Except not really. Because 3 hours later he's checking again. Not intentionally. At least that's what he tells himself. He opens the app. Sees her profile picture. Looks at her latest post. Closes the app. And immediately feels stupid. Why am I doing this? I don't care. Then why did you check? No answer. Because the answer is uncomfortable. Part of him does care. More than he wants to admit. Not necessarily because he's in love. Not necessarily because he wants her back. Sometimes he just wants evidence. Evidence that she still exists in the emotional space he left her in. Evidence that she still thinks about him. Evidence that he's not the only one feeling something. And that's where things get painfully human. Because uncertainty creates strange behavior. The mind hates unfinished stories. It hates emotional ambiguity. It wants answers. Closure. Resolution. Something. Anything. And when those things don't exist, it starts searching. Sometimes in ridiculous ways. One man once admitted he memorized the pattern of her social media activity. Not intentionally. At least not at first. He just noticed things. What time she usually posted. How often she disappeared. Which friends appeared regularly. Then one day he realized he had become an accidental detective in a mystery nobody asked him to solve. And the worst part? He knew it was ridiculous. That's what makes these behaviors so painful. Awareness doesn't stop them. Sometimes awareness makes them more embarrassing. Because now he watches himself doing it. Watching himself care. Watching himself pretend not to care. Watching himself become someone he doesn't recognize. Then comes the second behavior. The message. Not the sent message. The unsent message. The one that lives in drafts. The one that gets typed and deleted. Typed and deleted. Typed and deleted again. Maybe it starts with something casual. Hey. Delete. Hope you're doing well. Delete. Saw something that reminded me of you. Delete. How have you been? Delete. The cursor blinks. The phone screen glows. Nothing gets sent. And somehow that feels worse. Because now he's trapped between two realities. One part of him wants connection. The other part wants protection. One part wants answers. The other part is terrified of what the answers might be. So he stays suspended. Not moving forward. Not moving backward. Just staring at a conversation box like it contains the meaning of life. And maybe you've seen this happen. Maybe you've done it. Maybe you've sat in bed at midnight reading a message you never sent. Knowing exactly what you wanted to say. Unable to press send. Because pressing send means risking reality. And reality is dangerous. Fantasy still contains possibility. Reality contains answers. And answers can hurt. Especially when you're not ready for them. Then there are the accidental rituals. The behaviors that become habits without permission. Opening old conversations. Scrolling through photographs. Listening to voice notes. Reading exchanges that made no sense to save. I think this is one of the strangest parts of missing someone. The mind doesn't replay the important conversations. It replays random moments. Ding moments. A joke. A typo. A sarcastic comment. A picture of her lunch. A voice note where she's laughing before she starts talking. Completely meaningless things. Until they aren't. Because now those tiny moments feel alive. More alive than the present sometimes. And he knows that's unhealthy. He knows nostalgia edits reality. He knows memory leaves things out. Yet he keeps returning. Not because he wants the past. Because the past feels emotionally accessible. The present doesn't. The present is uncertain. The past is complete. And certainty is comforting. Even when it hurts. One of the strangest behaviors happens when he starts creating reasons to contact her. Not honest reasons. Indirect reasons. The kind that sound reasonable on the surface. Questions he could easily answer himself. Information she doesn't actually need. Random observations. Anything that creates a bridge without admitting he misses her. Because admitting he misses her feels too vulnerable. So instead he says things like, "Hey, did you ever figure out?" Or, "Random question." Or, "I just remembered." What he's really saying is something else entirely. He's saying, "Do I still exist in your world? Do you still feel anything when my name appears? Are we really becoming strangers?" But those questions never get typed. They're too exposed. Too honest. Too dangerous. So they hide behind logistics. Small talk. Convenient excuses. And sometimes even that doesn't happen. Sometimes he just stares at her name, then puts the phone down. Because longing and pride often sit at the same table. And they rarely get along. That's another truth nobody talks about. A lot of emotional avoidance isn't a lack of feeling. It's an excess of feeling. Too much uncertainty. Too much vulnerability. Too much risk. So instead of reaching out, he does something else. He waits. Which sounds passive. But emotionally, waiting can be exhausting. Because while the outside world sees silence, inside there's constant movement. Should I text? No. Why not? Because it's pointless. Is it? Maybe not. Then why aren't you doing it? No answer. That conversation can repeat for weeks. Months sometimes. A private argument nobody hears. A loop. A mental hallway with no exit. Then comes another behavior that people almost never admit. Looking for signs. Not direct signs. Tiny signs. A song posted online. A quote. A change in behavior. A new photograph. Anything that might reveal how she's feeling without having to ask. Because asking requires courage. Observing requires distance. And distance feels safer. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. The irony is that these behaviors rarely provide relief. Most of the time they create more confusion. More questions. More uncertainty. Yet he keeps doing them. Why? Because human beings would rather have incomplete information than no information at all. Even breadcrumbs feel better than emptiness. Even speculation feels better than silence. At least temporarily. But eventually something starts happening. The behaviors themselves become revealing. Not what he's looking at. The fact that he's looking. Not the profile. Not the messages. Not the memories. The effort. The attention. The emotional energy. Suddenly he realizes something uncomfortable. People don't spend this much time circling something they don't care about. That's when denial starts cracking. Not dramatically. Quietly. One uncomfortable observation at a time. Why am I checking? Why am I rereading this? Why am I thinking about her while pretending I'm not? Why am I looking for signs? The answers arrive slowly. Painfully. Without ceremony. Because underneath all these strange little behaviors is a truth he keeps trying to avoid. He misses her. Not perfectly. Not constantly. Not in some movie-like way. But enough. Enough to keep checking. Enough to keep wondering. Enough to keep carrying conversations that no longer exist. Enough to keep opening doors inside his mind that he swore he had already closed. And maybe the saddest part isn't the behavior itself. Maybe the saddest part is how private it all becomes. Nobody sees it. His friends don't see it. Coworkers don't see it. The world keeps interacting with the version of him that looks normal. The version that laughs. Works. Functions. Moves forward. Meanwhile, there's another version sitting alone at 11:48 p.m. Opening her profile. Closing it. Opening it again. Then locking the phone and staring at the ceiling. Trying to understand why someone who claims he's moving on keeps looking back. And somewhere in that uncomfortable silence, a truth begins forming. Not a dramatic truth. Not a profound truth. Just a painfully human one. The opposite of love isn't always indifference. Sometimes it's pretending to be indifferent while secretly hoping for one more sign that you're not alone in missing what disappeared. One of the most confusing parts of this experience is that he doesn't feel one thing. He feels several things at the same time, and some of them completely contradict each other. That's why it's so difficult to explain. Because people like clean stories. People like clear emotions. People like obvious answers. Did you want her or not? Did you love her or not? Do you miss her or not? Simple questions. Complicated answers. Because sometimes the truth is yes. And no. Simultaneously. Part of him misses her. Part of him feels relieved she's gone. Part of him wants her back. Part of him doesn't want to relive the emotional intensity. Part of him wants connection. Part of him wants distance. And all of those parts are telling the truth. That's what nobody prepares you for. The contradiction. The emotional civil war. The private argument that starts happening inside someone when loss becomes real. Because for a while, after her energy stops reaching him, there is relief. Real relief. Not fake relief. Not denial. Actual relief. The relationship had weight, expectations, emotional responsibility, unanswered questions, pressure. Not necessarily bad pressure. Just pressure. The kind that naturally comes when somebody matters. And when that pressure disappears, even temporarily, his body notices. The nervous tension eases. The obligation disappears. The emotional uncertainty quiets down. For a moment, he breathes easier. And then he feels guilty for breathing easier. That's where things get strange. Because now he's relieved. And sad. Free. And lonely. Lighter. And emptier. At the same time. Most people don't know what to do with emotions that conflict. So they choose one. They tell themselves one story. I miss her. Or, I'm better off without her. But real life rarely works that way. Real life is messier. Real life sounds more like this. I miss her. Then why don't you call her? Because I don't want things to go back to how they were. Then maybe you don't miss her. No. I do. Then why are you staying away? Because missing someone and being ready for them are not always the same thing. That's the conversation nobody hears. The one that happens in the dark. The one that happens while staring at a ceiling fan at 1:42 in the morning. The one that happens while driving home. The one that happens while pretending to focus on a movie. The internal debate. The endless contradiction. I think one of the hardest truths for him to accept is that loneliness doesn't automatically mean he wants the relationship back. Sometimes he just misses the feeling of being known. Sometimes he misses having someone to tell random things to. Sometimes he misses sending a photo when something funny happens. Sometimes he misses being expected. That's a strange word. Expected. But I think it matters. There's something emotionally grounding about knowing someone is expecting to hear from you. Expecting your opinion. Expecting your call. Expecting your presence. Then suddenly nobody is. And the freedom feels good. For about 5 minutes. Then it feels strange. Then it feels empty. Then it feels peaceful again. Then lonely again. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like emotional weather. Changing every few hours. Changing every few days. One afternoon he's convinced he's finally over it. He's productive. Focused. Energetic. He goes to the gym. Makes plans. Feels optimistic. Then later that night he's standing in the kitchen holding a glass of water and wondering what she's doing. Nothing happened. No trigger. No message. No memory. Just a feeling. Suddenly there. And now he's frustrated. Not because he misses her. Because he thought he was done missing her. People rarely talk about that frustration. The annoyance of still caring. The irritation of still feeling affected. The embarrassment of realizing somebody still occupies space in your mind. Especially after you've told yourself they don't. One man described it perfectly. He said, I was angry that I missed her. Not angry at her. Angry at himself. Because part of him believed he should have moved on already. Should have figured it out. Should have become emotionally independent. Instead, there he was. Months later. Thinking about someone while pretending not to. And that contradiction creates another problem. Sometimes he starts romanticizing the past. Not because the past was perfect. Because distance edits memories. Distance is a terrible historian. It removes context. Removes frustration. Removes incompatibility. Removes difficult conversations. Leaves behind warmth. Leaves behind comfort. Leaves behind nostalgia. So now he finds himself missing moments that used to irritate him. The long phone calls. The constant questions. The emotional intensity. Things he once complained about. Things he once felt overwhelmed by. Now they're gone. And somehow their absence hurts. That's one of the strangest psychological reversals. The thing that once felt heavy becomes the thing he misses carrying. I remember someone saying, "I wanted space until I got it." And honestly, that sentence probably explains more relationships than people realize. Because space sounds wonderful when you're overwhelmed, but actual distance feels different. Actual distance has consequences. Actual distance removes things. And sometimes those removed things turn out to matter more than expected. Then comes another contradiction. He misses her. But if she suddenly appeared at his door, he wouldn't know what to do. That's the truth. People imagine clarity. Reality often delivers confusion. He spends weeks wishing she would reach out, then imagines her reaching out, and immediately feels nervous. What would I even say? What if nothing changed? What if everything changed? What if I hurt her again? What if she doesn't feel the same? What if she does? The fantasy feels safer than reality. The longing feels easier than the conversation. So he stays stuck between desire and fear, between connection and avoidance, between relief and loss. And somewhere inside him, two voices keep arguing. I miss her. Do you miss her? Yes. Or do you miss being loved? I don't know. Do you want her back? Maybe. Or do you just hate being alone? I don't know. Would things be different this time? Silence. Those silent answers are often the most honest ones. Because uncertainty isn't weakness. Uncertainty is reality. And reality is rarely clean. That's what makes these moments feel so human. He's not having a grand realization. He's not becoming enlightened. He's not discovering the meaning of love. He's sitting in confusion, trying to separate what he feels from what he fears, trying to separate loneliness from longing, trying to separate memory from reality. And those are difficult things to untangle, especially when the heart and the ego want different outcomes. The heart wants closeness. The ego wants protection. The heart wants vulnerability. The ego wants certainty. The heart says, reach out. The ego says, don't risk it. The heart says, tell the truth. The ego says, stay quiet. And every day becomes a negotiation between those voices. Sometimes the heart wins. Sometimes the ego wins. Most days neither wins. Most days he simply exists somewhere in between. Half moving on. Half looking back. Half relieved. Half grieving. Half free. Half lonely. Which sounds irrational. But human beings are irrational. Especially when attachment, regret, memory, and uncertainty all collide. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this chapter. Not a profound lesson. Just an honest observation. The reason he struggles so much isn't because he feels too much. It's because he feels too many opposite things at once. And nobody ever taught him that conflicting emotions can coexist. That you can miss someone and not want them back. That you can love freedom and hate loneliness. That you can crave intimacy and fear it in the same breath. That you can feel grateful for the distance, while secretly wishing her name would appear on your phone one more time. So he sits there, caught between relief and loss, not fully wanting the past, not fully embracing the future, just existing in that uncomfortable middle space. The space where contradiction lives. The space where most real emotional experiences actually happen. And for perhaps the first time in his life, he's beginning to understand that confusion isn't a sign he never cared. Sometimes confusion is exactly what caring feels like when certainty is gone. The strange thing is, it isn't the big memories that stay. At least not usually. People assume heartbreak works like a movie. That he spends his nights replaying first kisses, anniversaries, life-changing conversations, the dramatic moments, the obvious moments. Sometimes those memories show up, but they're not the ones that linger. They're not the ones that ambush him while he's buying groceries. They're not the ones that appear when he's trying to fall asleep. They're not the ones that make him stop mid-sentence because something suddenly caught in his chest. No. The memories that refuse to leave him alone are usually embarrassingly ordinary. And that's what makes them so powerful. Because they don't feel important enough to hurt this much. Yet somehow they do. Maybe it's her laugh. Not even a specific memory. Just her laugh. The sound of it. The weird way she'd laugh when she was genuinely surprised. The way she'd try to stop laughing and somehow make herself laugh harder. A completely useless memory. A memory with no practical value. Yet 6 months later he's standing in line somewhere and hears someone laugh in a similar way. Not identical. Just similar enough. And suddenly his body reacts before his mind does. His head turns. His stomach drops. For half a second he thinks, her. It isn't her. Of course it isn't. But the reaction already happened. The body doesn't wait for facts. That's one of the most frustrating things about memory. People think memory lives in the mind. A lot of it lives in the body. In reflexes. In recognition. In nervous system responses that happen faster than thought. And sometimes those responses feel ridiculous. He'll be having a perfectly normal day. Then suddenly a scent catches him off guard. A shampoo. A perfume. A laundry detergent. Something ordinary. And now for the next 20 minutes he's emotionally somewhere else. Not because he's trying to be. Because memory doesn't ask permission. It just arrives. I think that's what catches him off guard. The randomness. The lack of control. The fact that he can go 3 weeks without thinking about her. Then get emotionally sideswiped by something as stupid as a coffee order. One man told me he was standing behind a woman in a cafe. The woman ordered the exact drink she always used to order. That was it. Nothing else. No conversación. No resemblance. Just the drink. And suddenly he couldn't stop thinking about her all afternoon. Not because of the drink. Because the drink carried an entire emotional landscape behind it. Memory works that way. One tiny detail unlocks an entire room. And now he's standing in a room he wasn't expecting to enter. The hardest memories are often the most ordinary. The way she'd say his name. The way she'd roll her eyes. The way she'd send voice notes instead of texts. The way she'd take forever to choose something from a menu. The way she'd ask questions when everyone else had stopped listening. The way she'd say drive safe. Such a small thing. Drive safe. 3 seconds. 2 words. Thousands of people say those words every day. But now nobody says them. And somehow that matters. That's the part nobody prepares you for. The grief attached to tiny acts of care. The things that looked invisible while they were happening. Then suddenly become enormous in retrospect. And the worst memories aren't always warm. Some of them are awkward. Some of them are annoying. Some of them are things he used to complain about. Which makes it even stranger. Because now he's missing things that once irritated him. The long stories. The repeated questions. The emotional conversations he wasn't always ready for. The things he occasionally avoided. Now he finds himself wishing he could hear them one more time. Not forever. Just once. Just enough to experience them differently. That's one of the cruel tricks memory plays. It lets you revisit moments. But not change your participation in them. You can replay the conversation. You can't answer differently. You can revisit the memory. You can't relive it. And sometimes that's where regret starts growing. Not dramatic regret. Small regret. Specific regret. The kind that arrives while staring out a window. I should have listened more. I should have paid attention. I should have stayed on that call longer. I should have asked one more question. Not because the relationship would have magically worked. Because now he understands the value of moments he treated as ordinary. And understanding always seems to arrive late. That's another thing nobody talks about. How memory edits emotional significance. Things that felt ordinary become sacred. Things that felt repetitive become comforting. Things that felt small become enormous. And now he's carrying around a collection of moments he never intended to keep. The memory of her sitting in the passenger seat. The memory of her reaching for his hand. The memory of a random Tuesday. A random conversation. A random silence. Not the life-changing events. The tiny scenes. The background scenes. The moments nobody would put in a movie. Because real attachment grows in ordinary places. Not grand ones. And that's why ordinary memories hurt so much. They were where real life happened. I remember someone saying, "I don't miss the relationship. I miss Tuesday." At first that sounded ridiculous. Then I understood exactly what he meant. He missed the normality. The routine. The expectation. The everyday presence. The fact that someone existed in the ordinary rhythm of his life. And now the rhythm is different. Not worse necessarily. Just different. But the mind keeps comparing. Without permission. Without invitation. Without mercy. He'll be driving somewhere. Remember a conversation from years ago. Then immediately argue with himself. Why am I thinking about this? It's over. Move on. But memory doesn't respond to commands. That's what makes it frustrating. You can't negotiate with it. You can't schedule it. You can't decide when it arrives. And you definitely can't decide which memory appears. The brain never seems interested in efficiency. It'll forget important passwords. Forget appointments. Forget birthdays. Then somehow preserve the exact sound of her laugh from 3 years ago. The exact expression on her face during one random conversation. The exact feeling of sitting next to her in complete silence. Why? Nobody knows. Maybe because emotions prioritize differently than logic does. Maybe because meaning survives where information disappears. Maybe because attachment leaves fingerprints on memory. Whatever the reason, those memories stay. And sometimes they become conversations. Private conversations. Internal conversations. The kind nobody hears. You miss her. No. I miss the memories. What's the difference? Silence. Would you go back? I don't know. Then what are you holding on to? Another silence. Because that's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes he isn't holding on to her. He's holding on to a version of himself that existed when she was there. A version that felt more connected. More alive. More understood. More emotionally open. And now every memory carries both people. Her. And the person he used to be around her. Which makes letting go complicated. Because what exactly is he grieving? The relationship? The possibility? The familiarity? The identity? The answer changes every day. That's why healing rarely feels linear. Some days he barely thinks about her. Other days, one random memory follows him around for 12 straight hours. Not because he's stuck. Because he's human. Memory isn't a straight line. It's weather. Some days clear. Some days cloudy. Some days a storm arrives for no reason. And eventually he realizes something. The memory isn't staying because it wants to torture him. It's staying because it was meaningful. That's all. Not every meaningful thing is meant to last forever. Not every important person is meant to stay. Not every memory is asking for reconciliation. Some memories simply refuse to disappear because they became part of who you are. And that's a much harder truth to accept. Because it means the goal isn't always forgetting. Sometimes the goal is learning how to live with remembering. And late at night, when the house is quiet, when the distractions are gone, when another random memory appears for no reason at all, he starts understanding something. The reason these tiny moments keep returning isn't because they're unfinished. It's because they were real. Painfully real. Ordinarily real. The kind of real that doesn't announce itself while it's happening. The kind you only recognize afterward. And maybe that's why those small memories refuse to leave him alone. Not because they're the biggest moments. Because they were the truest ones. There comes a point where the distractions stop working. Not all at once. Not dramatically. They just become less effective. Like a painkiller slowly wearing off. At first he doesn't notice. He keeps doing what he's always done. Working. Keeping busy. Making plans. Finding ways to fill space. Finding ways to fill silence. Finding ways to stay one step ahead of whatever he's feeling. And for a while it works. Or at least it seems to. That's the thing about emotional avoidance. People imagine it as denial. But most of the time it looks surprisingly functional. He goes to work. Baby. Answers messages. Shows up for responsibilities. Laughs at jokes. Makes future plans. From the outside, everything looks normal. Maybe even successful. That's what makes it difficult to identify. Nobody sees the energy required to maintain that version of himself. Nobody sees how tired he is becoming. Because eventually carrying emotions and avoiding emotions start costing the same amount of energy. And that's usually when the cracks begin. Not because he's weak. Because he's exhausted. There's a difference. I think people underestimate how tiring emotional resistance can be. Keeping feelings contained requires effort. Constant effort. Monitoring yourself. Redirecting thoughts. Changing the subject internally. Pushing things aside. Convincing yourself you're fine. Again. And again. And again. Eventually the mind gets tired. Eventually the body gets tired. Eventually the performance becomes difficult to maintain. And that's when something changes. Not externally. Internally. He starts noticing the distractions aren't creating relief anymore. The gym helps. But only while he's there. Work helps. But only until the drive home. Friends help. But eventually everyone leaves. The house gets quiet. The apartment gets quiet. The hotel room gets quiet. Whatever space he's living in becomes quiet. And now it's just him again. No noise. No movement. No escape route. Just him. And whatever he's been postponing. I remember someone describing this stage perfectly. He said, "I wasn't getting worse. I was running out of places to hide." That stayed with me. Because that's exactly what it feels like. The feelings aren't growing. The avoidance is shrinking. Those are different experiences. For months he believed he was moving on because he wasn't thinking about her constantly. Then one day he realizes something uncomfortable. He spent most of that time staying occupied. Not processing. Occupied. There's a difference. And once that realization appears, it's difficult to ignore. Now every distraction starts revealing itself. The extra work. The endless scrolling. The constant activity. The unnecessary busyness. The packed schedule. The emotional multitasking. Suddenly he sees it. Not all of it. Just enough. Enough to make him uncomfortable. Enough to make him honest. And honesty usually arrives in small pieces. Not grand revelations. Tiny admissions. The kind nobody hears. Maybe he catches himself opening her profile again. Then instead of creating another excuse, he finally says it. To himself. Okay. I was hoping to see something. Not because I want her back. Not because I don't. Just because I was hoping. That's progress. Not healing. Not closure. Honesty. Those are different things. People confuse them all the time. Honesty comes first. Healing comes later. And sometimes much later. The real cracking starts when he becomes unable to maintain his favorite narrative. The narrative that says he's unaffected. Because eventually reality keeps contradicting it. He still thinks about her. Still remembers things. Still wonders. Still feels things unexpectedly. And after enough evidence piles up, denial becomes exhausting. Not impossible. Just exhausting. So he starts admitting things. Quietly. Reluctantly. Without audience. Without performance. Without pretending. And what he admits isn't always flattering. That's another thing people misunderstand. Self-awareness isn't always beautiful. Sometimes self-awareness is embarrassing. Sometimes it's ugly. Sometimes it reveals things you'd rather not know. Like realizing he knew she was pulling away before she actually did. He just didn't want to deal with it. Or realizing he recognized her loneliness long before he acknowledged it. Or realizing he expected her to keep reaching even when he wasn't reaching back. Those realizations aren't empowering. They're uncomfortable. Because now responsibility enters the room. Not blame. Responsibility. Different thing. Blame says, everything was my fault. Responsibility says, there were things I didn't want to see. And sometimes that's harder. Because responsibility doesn't allow easy villains. Not her. Not him. Just two human beings. Missing things. Avoiding things. Misunderstanding things. Hurting each other accidentally. That's usually where emotional maturity begins. Not with certainty. With complexity. With realizing nobody was completely right. Nobody was completely wrong. Just human. Painfully human. Another crack appears when new connections fail to provide the relief he expected. That's a difficult one. Because part of him assumes moving forward will solve everything. Meet someone new. Stay busy. Keep progressing. Problem solved. Except human beings don't work like software updates. New attention doesn't automatically erase old emotions. New attraction doesn't automatically create resolution. Sometimes he goes on dates. Sometimes he meets interesting people. Sometimes he genuinely enjoys himself. Then something strange happens. He gets home. The night ends. The conversation ends. And whatever he was avoiding is still there. Not because the new person is lacking. Because unfinished feelings don't disappear just because something new arrives. That's another crack. Another uncomfortable realization. Another defense failing. Then comes the late-night honesty. The kind that arrives when sleep won't. Those conversations with himself become harder to escape. Do you still miss her? Sometimes. Would you admit that out loud? Probably not. Why? Because it feels vulnerable. Do you still care? Silence. That's usually where the answer lives. Inside the silence. Not because he doesn't know. Because he does. He just doesn't like the answer. And maybe that's what this stage really is. Not emotional collapse. Emotional exposure. The walls aren't falling because they're weak. They're falling because they're no longer necessary. Or at least no longer effective. And when defenses stop working, people often become softer before they become stronger. Nobody likes hearing that. Especially men. Because softness feels dangerous. Softness feels vulnerable. Softness feels uncertain. But beneath all that discomfort, something important is happening. He's finally experiencing reality instead of managing it. Feeling reality instead of negotiating with it. Admitting reality instead of arguing with it. And reality sounds less dramatic than people expect. Reality sounds like, yeah, that hurt more than I admitted. Reality sounds like, I cared more than I said. Reality sounds like, part of me thought she'd always be there. Reality sounds like, I wasn't as detached as I pretended. Not profound statements. Just honest ones. Painfully ordinary truths. The kind people usually discover long after everyone else assumes they've moved on. And here's the irony. This is often the moment he starts becoming more emotionally available. Not because he suddenly understands relationships. Not because he has all the answers. Because he's finally stopped lying to himself. Or at least stopped lying as much. And that changes things. Slowly. Subtly. The defensive version of him begins losing influence. The version that always needed distance. Always needed control. Always needed certainty. That version becomes harder to maintain. Because reality has accumulated too much evidence. Evidence that he cared. Evidence that he was affected. Evidence that he lost something meaningful. Evidence that pretending otherwise no longer works. So now he sits with it. Not gracefully. Not perfectly. Some nights he still avoids. Some days he still distracts himself. Some mornings he wakes up convinced he's completely over it. Then a memory appears. A feeling appears. A realization appears. And he has to start over. That's normal. That's human. What matters is that the defenses are no longer running the entire show. The truth is getting airtime now. And truth has a quiet way of changing people. Not overnight. Not dramatically. One honest admission at a time. One uncomfortable realization at a time. One crack at a time. Until eventually he looks back and recognizes something. The hardest part wasn't losing her. The hardest part was losing the story he told himself about how little she mattered. Because now that story is gone. The defenses are cracking. The distractions are fading. And underneath everything, for the first time, he's finally meeting his own feelings without a bodyguard. There is a conversation that follows some people for years. Not an actual conversation. Not one that happened. The opposite. The conversation that never happened. The words that never left his mouth. The text that stayed in drafts. The phone call he rehearsed but never made. The apology that arrived 6 months too late. The truth he understood only after the moment for saying it had already passed. And if you've ever carried one of those conversations, you know something strange about them. They don't get quieter with time. They get more detailed. Because the mind keeps finishing what reality never allowed it to finish. It keeps returning, rewriting, editing, replaying, trying to complete something unfinished. That's where he finds himself now. Not grieving the relationship exactly. Not even grieving her. Grieving the things he never said. And those things have weight. More weight than people realize. Because there is a unique kind of pain attached to delayed honesty. Not dishonesty. Delayed honesty. The moment when you finally understand what you should have said. After the opportunity has disappeared. I think almost everyone has experienced this in some form. A conversation in the shower. An explanation while driving. A perfect response arriving 3 months too late. The human brain seems exceptionally talented at producing clarity after it's no longer useful. And nowhere is that more painful than in relationships. Because now he starts remembering moments differently. Not because the memories changed. Because he changed. His understanding changed. The context changed. The emotional distance created perspective. And perspective can be brutal. He remembers a conversation. A simple one. Maybe she asked, "Are you okay?" And maybe he answered, "Yeah." End of discussion. At the time it felt insignificant. Now, years later, he realizes she wasn't asking about his day. She was asking about him. Really asking. Trying to reach somewhere deeper. Trying to understand something he wasn't willing to discuss. And now the answer he wishes he had given arrives. Not then. Now. When it no longer matters. Or at least no longer matters in the same way. That's the frustrating thing. Understanding often arrives after usefulness. And suddenly his mind becomes crowded with alternative versions of the past. Version after version. Conversations rewritten. Moments revised. Truths finally spoken. Only inside his head. I should have told her I was scared. I should have told her I didn't know what I wanted. I should have told her I was overwhelmed. I should have told her I cared. I should have told her I wasn't as detached as I pretended. Those sentences sound simple now. But back then they felt impossible. That's another uncomfortable truth. People judge their past selves using information they didn't have at the time. From today's perspective, vulnerability seems obvious. Back then it felt terrifying. Back then avoidance felt safer. Back then silence felt easier. Back then keeping things vague felt manageable. Now he's living with the consequences of that choice. And consequences often look like conversations with nobody present. The late night kind. The imaginary kind. The painfully specific kind. He imagines her sitting across from him. Maybe at a kitchen table. maybe in a parked car, maybe in some place that only exists in memory now. And finally, he says the things he couldn't say before. Not because she's there. Because he's finally ready. The cruel irony. The timing is backwards. The courage arrived after the opportunity. That's what regret often is. Not wishing you had loved someone more. Wishing you had been honest sooner. There's a difference. One man described it in a way I never forgot. He said, "I wasn't hiding from her. I was hiding from what I felt when I was with her." That sentence stayed with me. Because that's what happens sometimes. People think avoidance is about the other person. Often it's about themselves. The emotions. The vulnerability. The uncertainty. The fear. The exposure. The reality that someone matters. And once he understands that, another layer of the conversation appears. Not the conversation he never had with her. The conversation he never had with himself. Did you love her? Silence. Why are you still avoiding the question? Because I don't know. Do you really not know? More silence. Because sometimes I don't know means something. Sometimes it means confusion. Sometimes it means complexity. Sometimes it means, I know, but I'm not ready to say it. And this chapter is full of those moments. Moments where truth almost surfaces. Then retreats. Surfaces again. Then retreats again. Like waves. Not because he's dishonest. Because emotional honesty often arrives in fragments. Small pieces. Tiny admissions. Rarely all at once. I think that's why unsent messages become so important. Not because they change anything. Because they reveal something. Every deleted text contains a truth. Every unfinished draft contains a truth. Every abandoned conversation contains a truth. Maybe not about her. About him. What he wanted. What he feared. What he couldn't say. What he needed. What he missed. And sometimes he opens those drafts again. Not literally. Emotionally. He revisits them. The things he almost said. The things he stopped himself from saying. The things pride interrupted. The things fear interrupted. The things timing interrupted. Then comes the hardest realization. Some conversations were never supposed to happen. Not because they didn't matter. Because the version of him who needed to have them no longer exists. That's painful. But it's also strangely true. There are things he understands now that he couldn't have understood then. There are words he can speak now that he couldn't have spoken then. There is vulnerability available now that wasn't available then. Growth creates painful clarity. And clarity has a habit of pointing backward. Look, that's what you were feeling. Look, that's what she was trying to tell you. Look, that's what you were avoiding. The evidence seems obvious now. It rarely felt obvious at the time. And maybe that's what makes regret so lonely. Nobody else can fully experience your version of it. Nobody else knows the exact sentence you should have said. The exact call you should have made. The exact moment you should have stayed instead of leaving. Those details belong only to you. Which is why they become so haunting. So personal. So persistent. Then another conversation starts happening. One that is even more uncomfortable. The conversation between him and reality. Would saying it have changed everything? Maybe. Maybe not. Would the apology have saved it? I don't know. Would the truth have fixed things? Silence. Because that's the part nobody likes. Sometimes the regret isn't about losing the outcome. It's about losing the chance. The chance to be honest. The chance to be vulnerable. The chance to show up differently. The chance to know what might have happened. And uncertainty can live inside a person for a very long time. Longer than certainty sometimes. Because certainty ends. Uncertainty lingers. It keeps asking questions. Keeps opening doors. Keeps replaying scenes. Keeps creating alternate realities. Then eventually, after enough nights and enough memories and enough imaginary conversations, something changes. Not resolution. Acceptance. A quieter thing. A sadder thing. He begins understanding that the conversation he wanted most was never really with her. Not entirely. It was with the version of himself who stayed silent. The version who deflected. Avoided. Minimized. Pretended. The version who felt deeply and expressed very little. That's who he keeps revisiting. That's who he keeps trying to understand. And maybe that's why the conversation never completely disappears. Because it's no longer about reconciliation. It's about self-recognition. It's about finally seeing himself clearly. Not the hero. Not the victim. Just a person. A flawed person. A scared person. A loving person. An avoidant person. A contradictory person. A human being. The same way all of us are. And somewhere deep into another sleepless night, another imaginary conversation begins. Only this one sounds different. I should have told her. Maybe. I should have been honest. Probably. Would it have changed everything? I don't know. Then what hurts? A long silence. Finally followed by the truth. I became the person capable of saying it. After the moment had already passed. And sometimes that's the conversation that stays with him the longest. Not because he lost her. Because he met himself too late. People often think they know what breaks a man. They think it's rejection. They think it's losing someone. They think it's watching her walk away. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. The older I get, the less convinced I am that heartbreak happens in the obvious moments. I think the real breaking point is quieter than that. More private. More difficult to explain. Because what actually breaks him isn't always her absence. It's understanding her presence. Far too late. And that's not the same thing. Losing someone hurts. Realizing what they were carrying after they're gone hurts differently. It has a different texture. A different weight. A different kind of silence. Because now he isn't grieving what happened. He's grieving what he finally understands. And understanding can be brutal. Especially when it arrives after the fact. By this point, he's replayed everything. The silence. The memories. The unsent messages. The conversations that never happened. The contradictions. The relief. The regret. All of it. And somewhere in the middle of that process, something shifts. Not dramatically. Not all at once. A realization begins forming. Slowly. Painfully. Like a photograph developing in dark water. He starts seeing something he couldn't see before. She wasn't just part of his life. She was touching parts of him he wasn't touching himself. And that's difficult to admit. Because it sounds like dependence. It isn't. At least not entirely. It's something more ordinary. More human. She noticed things he ignored. She asked questions he avoided. She created emotional spaces he didn't know how to create alone. She reached places inside him that he often kept locked. And now those places feel strangely empty. Not because she took something with her. Because she was helping him access something he couldn't easily access by himself. That's the realization. The painful one. The one that arrives at 2 a.m. The one that arrives while driving. The one that arrives while folding laundry or standing in a grocery store or staring at a ceiling. Not because she's there. Because she's not. And suddenly he understands the role she was playing in his emotional life. Not intentionally. Not consciously. But consistently. I remember someone saying, "She knew me better than I knew myself." Then he immediately corrected himself. No, that's not true. A pause. Then, she paid attention to parts of me that I wasn't paying attention to. That's different. And it's probably closer to the truth. Because what breaks him isn't the fantasy that she was perfect. It's realizing she was real. And real people leave fingerprints. Not on your skin. On your routines. Your habits. Your emotional landscape. Your inner life. And those fingerprints remain long after the person is gone. Which is why months later he still catches himself thinking, I should tell her that. Then remembering he can't. Or maybe he can. But it wouldn't be the same. The reflex is still there. The reaching. The impulse. The instinct to share. And every time that instinct has nowhere to go, he feels the absence again. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a missing stair you forgot was missing until you stepped there. Again. And again. And again. That's what finally wears him down. Not one huge moment. Thousands of tiny moments. Tiny absences. Tiny realizations. Tiny reminders. Accumulating. Until one day the truth becomes unavoidable. She mattered. More than he admitted. More than he understood. More than he allowed himself to see. And that realization creates a strange kind of grief. Because now there is nobody to argue with. Nobody to blame. Nobody to convince. Just reality. Just him. Just the truth. And truth can be surprisingly lonely. Especially when it arrives after everyone else thinks the story is over. Because that's another thing people rarely discuss. The deepest emotional processing often happens after the visible relationship ends. After the conversations stop. After the explanations stop. After the audience leaves. The world thinks he's done grieving. Meanwhile, he's only now beginning to understand what he's grieving. And those are different timelines. One public. One private. One obvious. One invisible. The invisible timeline is where the real work happens. The uncomfortable work. The work where he stops asking whether she misses him. And starts asking why her absence affects him so deeply. The work where he stops analyzing her behavior. And starts examining his own. The work where he stops looking outward. And starts looking inward. That's when the final defense usually collapses. The idea that none of this mattered. The idea that he can simply outthink it. Outwork it. Outrun it. Eventually he realizes something. He wasn't running from her. Not really. He was running from what her presence revealed. His needs. His fears. His attachment. His loneliness. His longing. His capacity for intimacy. The parts of himself that felt exposed when someone got close enough to see them. And maybe that's why her energy affected him so much. Because it illuminated things. Not in some mystical way. In a human way. A practical way. A painfully ordinary way. She asked questions. She paid attention. She stayed present. She reflected things back to him. And now the reflection is gone. Not completely. Just enough that he notices. And that's what finally breaks him. Not rejection. Recognition. Recognition arriving too late. Recognition of value. Recognition of effort. Recognition of love. Recognition of what was actually happening while he was busy protecting himself. Because protection has consequences. Avoidance has consequences. Emotional distance has consequences. Not punishments. Consequences. And now he's sitting with them. Not heroically. Not gracefully. Just honestly. For maybe the first time. There's an internal dialogue that often appears here. One final conversation. One final argument. I thought she would always be there. Did you? No. Then why did you act like it? A long silence. Not because he lacks an answer. Because he has too many. Because he was scared. Because he was distracted. Because he was immature. Because he was overwhelmed. Because he thought there would be more time. Because human beings are incredibly good at assuming tomorrow exists. Until one day it doesn't. And maybe that's the saddest part. Not losing someone. Assuming you'll have another chance to appreciate them. Another chance to listen. Another chance to ask questions. Another chance to be honest. Another chance to show up. Then discovering life doesn't always offer another chance. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Nobody knows. And uncertainty is difficult to live with. But eventually he stops fighting that uncertainty. Not because he found closure, because closure is often overrated. Real life rarely gives perfect endings. Real life leaves loose threads, unanswered questions, unfinished feelings, lingering memories, and somehow people keep living anyway. That's what happens here. He keeps living. He keeps working. Keeps laughing. Keeps moving forward. But something has changed. Not because he got her back. Not because he fully moved on. Because he finally told himself the truth. The truth that was waiting underneath every distraction. Every memory. Every regret. Every sleepless night. She mattered. That's it. Not a grand revelation. Not a philosophical breakthrough. Just a simple truth. She mattered. And maybe the real breaking point isn't when that truth hurts. Maybe it's when he stops trying to make it hurt less. When he stops arguing with it. Stops minimizing it. Stops explaining it away. And simply sits beside it. Quietly. Like an old friend. Like a wound that became a scar. Like a memory that never fully leaves. Not because he's trapped in the past. Because some people remain part of your emotional history long after they stop being part of your daily life. And in the silence that follows, there is no dramatic ending. No perfect resolution. No final lesson. Just a man sitting alone with a truth he spent months avoiding. A truth that finally caught him. A truth that no longer needs defending against. A truth simple enough to fit inside a single sentence. She stopped reaching. And only then did he realize how far her energy had been reaching all along.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.